Oh, a lot of my stuff has just been, you're looking at the data you're collecting, right? You've got a protocol and you're kind of just reviewing, you're making sure they're meeting the criteria. And then it's amazing then how much you've seen and you've always collected ethnicity, right? And sometimes it's answered, but there's really just been, to me, at least in the last, I don't know, 3 or 4 years, where they're really looking at that as a reason of not making it into the trial, right? You always want to have a trial that's spread out and it's, in areas where you would have diverse subjects. But it's really just been more recently that they've really concentrated in looking at it as far as, oh, they didn't make it in because they didn't meet certain lab parameters. And it's also based on an ethnicity, and then just starting to look at maybe some of those parameters maybe needing to be changed because they would automatically disclude certain populations.
I see, because we would just naturally have that in our genetics or in our, makeup in that ethnicity, you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah. It's just ethnically certain lab normals, they come back at different levels, whether it's, sometimes it's creatinine or some ALTs or ASTs, some different ones for different ethnicities. Their normal range would be considered high or low and disqualify them from a certain protocol. So you would just look at it as their whatever was high. Oh, they might have a history of liver disease or alcoholism or something like that, and not really correlate it so closely to the ethnic
yes,
normality. And
right.
It's
you wouldn't attribute
range.
it to that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Interesting. And you've done a range of, all the way from very common diseases to more now probably rare diseases at Horizon.
Mm-hmm.
Have you seen any differences there? Because, it's rare to begin with, so therefore the recruitment is difficult. And if you say we want to make sure we have a diverse range of people, that's got to add an extra degree of difficulty.
Yeah, and it does, but it depends on the disease, and it depends on the lab ranges that they're looking at. They're collecting, and a lot of times what they're concentrating on are for whatever specific disease that they're looking at, the surrounding lab parameters, and you're looking for safety, and making sure also that certain diseases that are you don't want in it, like when you're looking at a diabetes, you're looking at your A1C, and then maybe some of the other lab normals that you're looking at is just making sure, like if you don't want them to have hypertension, or if cardiac function could be. So you're just naturally looking at these different things for safety reasons. But then depending on what ones of those that you're looking at, and if in certain ethnic populations, they are seeing that as disclusionary. So I think in rare disease, I think they've been a little bit more flexible, in which they're starting to open up some of those parameters. Conversely, though, too, something like a sickle cell study, which is predominantly in African American population. So what you're looking at there to note as sickle cell is some of the other parameters would be high in other populations or low in other populations, but because of that population, it's fairly normal as well. So I think they're trying to make a concerted effort. I know what we're looking at is really, when we're going and selecting sites, there has been a pretty big focus on getting the ethnic population, like when you're first starting to talk to sites, you know, finding out what is your ethnic makeup of your patient population. And they're really trying to pull in that data early on and get that so they can be looking at what could be halting progress in the study as well, and making sure they're including people. And they're starting to include a lot more to collect for future studies too, going on to different phases as well.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So one thing I was going to ask you, Gretchen, and that you just brought up, if you're going to a site with a quote unquote existing population, meaning there's, you know, referral patterns or, you know, specialists already seeing these types of patients, you're almost already automatically excluding people that don't go to the doctor for X, Y, and Z condition, or they're not within that system already.
Well, we tap into two different things. So especially in the rare disease, you know, you're looking at patient populations that are probably coming from far and wide, right? So there's centers and hubs, and I'll correlate it. I did hemophilia for 8 years, right? So there are certain centers, and no matter, you know, where you live, but in a huge radius, that's where those people are going to be going to. Now, do they go to the doctor regularly? Probably not, especially hemophilia. It's in males. Y'all are notoriously really kind of caca and going through regular stuff.
We got it all figured out already.
Yes.
Dr. Schmuck.
But at least there is some sort of registry, because some of these things are denoted at birth, you know, or very young. So there are kind of that. But not only are you doing that, but you also tap into social media, and advocacy groups have been really one of the core things that you tap into for recruiting for these, because we do know that a lot of times, sometimes maybe they don't go to the doctor, but when they're a rare disease, and especially a lot of these, they tend to be quite crippling or life-threatening. So if you haven't gone and you're not figured out, you might not be around. So I think in some of these, you know, whether they care for themselves or not, somehow they're usually linked with a group that is already prevalent, and really reaching out through some of those advocacy or parent networks, especially if you're doing some of these, you know, pediatric type of rare diseases, and really trying to tap out. But it's not just rare disease that you have that trouble too. Things like if you were doing kind of a fatty liver type of study, there's a lot of people walking around with it that really don't know, and it's just not properly diagnosed. You know, there's some diseases that are mistaken for other diseases, and that is where you really are kind of looking for specialists that reach out to more kind of family practice type of groups, and go through and really try to pull from there, looking at lab ranges. But then again, you know, needing to collect the information to know what is normal for every ethnic group. And I think that's kind of some of the data that they're really starting to pull in, collect. So then they know this is normal for Caucasians, but it's not normal for Asians or African Americans. And you know, we need to write the protocol with lab normals being this for this ethnicity and this for this ethnicity. And I think they're just starting to do that.
Mm-hmm. And
what I don't think they always know that information.
Makes sense. And what about any other logistical? I think of like in the Latino community, if language is ever a barrier, or even, you know, not so, you know, we always say African American, Latino, and Asian, but, you know, you get into a Korean community, for example, and maybe there isn't as much English, or depending on these kind of neighborhoods in major cities. So are you seeing that again? It's a very real world practical question. I had one
Yeah,
center say, I can't recruit Spanish speaking patients if I don't have Spanish speaking consent forms and materials,
right,
you know?
right.
Oh,
And I will say, like, Spanish is pretty standard. So any
yes.
study done in the US will always have, I mean, I have not seen a study go out that didn't have English and Spanish. But it is one of the things that we asked for at different institutions. So, you know, and when I worked at building studies, like from the beginning, you know, of course, we look at the countries and the regions, and especially if it's a global study, we'll automatically get them translated into certain languages. And really doing research in Asia Pac is really kind of boom. So having those translations are there. Translation for consent and patient materials sometimes, and like I said, I'll go back to hemophilia. I've worked on those studies where I get a call from a site and they had I don't know, it wasn't Taiwanese, but it was a very specific certain dialect, right? And we didn't have a consent form. We probably weren't going to do a consent form for one patient, right? But you can use interpreters or family members as well. And that is one of the things I think you look for, making sure it's there, that it's not just in the consenting process, because you don't want them there. So I would tell a site, if you have a patient and you need it translated or you need something in a different language, okay, that's fine. But what's going to happen with all the other visits? Mm-hmm. And what's going to happen every time they're in and they need to communicate? Before you bring a study into that, you need to either have a consistent interpreter at your institution, and and sometimes it's certain institutions see certain populations, so they'll have people there that speak those languages. In New York, I'm sure all the research in Koreatown area, they're going to have people, or they need to have when they're consenting, they really need to ensure that family member is there with them at all times. And so that's one of the things that I think it usually is pretty standardly done, but then it's also up to the individual sites to make sure that they're reaching out. But I think, the physicians in the different areas of research are pretty well known, that they would bring to the table, I've got a large Indian population, and so I'm going to need this in Hindu or something like that. And if it's not able to be provided, because translations are quite costly because they have to be certified and back translated, so that whole process can be quite costly. So in a scheme of an 8,000 patient study for 15 patients, maybe it's not going to be it, but making sure that that's part of that whole process as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've also mentioned, conditions where I guess you're trying to make it as real world as possible, but if the recruiting doesn't match the real world prevalence, if you have an 80-20, but the prevalence is really 20-80, and I'm really using the extreme.
Right.
How do you try to reconcile that?
Well, I think, studies you see along the way, they change. So, protocols get amended along the way frequently. And oftentimes they get amended, especially in that recruitment phase. So, part of what you need to do is you need to collect, why were you not able to recruit? Or why did somebody fail that screening? And it's in that collection of reasons, which is why amendments do come out. And I mean, in a simplified way, I'll say that sometimes these protocols are written by bench scientists and PhDs and brilliant people, but they might not be in the real world practicality of things, right? Mm-hmm. Or if it's done from another country, not knowing how it's really done and what is a real world thing in other countries. I know a lot of companies, and so when that's discovered, then you have to amend your protocol around the way. I know a company I used to work for when I was working in hemophilia, we had a a group of nurses globally, so from around the world, that when we were having new protocols coming out, we actually brought them all together and had them having working groups on those protocols to look at it, because of the fact that they were written by people in Denmark that might not have had a clear idea of where your majority of your patients might be coming from, how things are handled that way, right? You know, so certain things like if you're utilizing electronic diaries and you're targeting areas in regions of internet is not so stable, that's not going to be a very reliable capture system to be able to get that data. And you need to have other ways. And if you use the electronic in certain areas, you need to have paper in other areas. And I think I'd like to say, you know, companies are looking at that. Do I see the big ones go out and it's just kind of pushed out? Yes. But I think, you know, depending on especially these smaller companies, who they might partner with in if they're having a CRO running, I mean, that should be some of the things that they're looking at as they're building their trial along the way. And it has, I mean, in all the years I've been in it, from when I started to now, you do see a lot of other parameters. But when I'd be working with different clients and planning their things, part of what I had to do was, all right, this population is going to have this, or this might be an issue, or this might be a recruitment thing. Where can we work on changing some of these parameters? And have you thought of this in your protocol? And having to give a little pushback on some of that. And some of the companies are, you know, yes, they change. Some of the companies are like, oh, we're brilliant and we just did the right thing. But
well, and you're right. I mean, even if you can find the right demographic mix, but if you're adding this complexity of the tools or the diaries, right, or the, you know, like you said, the technology piece, then you're almost eliminating the people who couldn't manage through, right, those. Yeah.
Right.
On a similar question then, you know, the trend now to decentralized, it's called by many names, but I'll use that term, decentralized trial, where people can either go to their own doctor and be monitored, or they just do it at home and they get monitored by some other, by phone or by internet or mm-hmm, what have you. Mm-hmm. But are you seeing that, again, in the context of diversity, are you seeing that as a method, an avenue to get more diversity?
Yes, I mean, I've seen it for a variety of ways. One of the things is some people who are looking at doing this and really doing this, we call them virtual trials, right? They were all pretty much remote and everything like that. I think there is the technology to do it. Technology comes with a cost. And I think a lot of people look at it as a really quick and easy way to do these certain types of trials. And there are certain trials that are great for it. But it comes at a pretty hefty price tag to be done correctly. And I think that's one of the things is that I was a big keen on is doing them is great if the parameters are in there to really ensure safety, because what can get looked over is that safety parameter. So not all trials would fit that model. And especially ones that you're testing, you know, especially in early phases when safety is really a big concern, probably wouldn't be the best ones. But they're coming up. It's just industry, technology and regulations have been approved for it for quite some time, but industry hasn't quite caught up to it. And they haven't quite caught up to letting go of the way things are done. And I think that's why it has taken so long to see the ethnic disparity in things and everything like that. And even in this time of COVID, when we were forced to do things like it wasn't going away in a month. Industry was having to change how they ran their studies, and still the reluctance and the inability to put those virtual aspects into place when they could be is unbelievable. And that's in the US, let alone in European or any other country, which again, then you're eliminating whole populations or whole areas of being able to market a drug or help a population, because the regulatory authorities didn't want to change their ways of doing things and reviewing things and having that. So that's part of the problem with it, especially with privacy laws in other countries.
Mm-hmm. So I mentioned to you that the company that's sponsoring me to do these interviews is called 83 Bar. I don't know if you know them specifically, but a patient recruitment firm, you know, using social media, using nurse call center screening, then referring to the sites. So, you know, maybe fewer referrals, but hopefully better quality. Okay. Because they've already been assessed. So rather than just sending the site coordinator 100 names saying good luck, you know, you've already screened them and evaluated them, and they already want to participate. Do you have experience working with firms like that in terms of, you know, what they could add to the party?
Yeah. And so, you know, so usually when I'm at, you know, when I work with CROs and we utilize them. So this is what I've seen with them. I've seen great recruitment firms and I've seen caca recruitment firms.
That's a clinical term.
Yes, I'm very clinical.
Yes.
So the thingamabobs and the doohickeys and the whatchamajiggers are all clinical terms.
It's all part of it.
Yeah, and especially in rare disease, I think patient recruitment and some of those tools and those models, I think, are essential. And they can be very helpful. But again, so when I was at IQVIA Biotech, right, we get all these small biotech companies coming to us to run their studies. Lots of rare disease, a lot of, I don't quite know the regulation stuff. You guys just take our mess and you run with it, right? And, oh, well, we want this, this, and this. You figure out how to do it. So we get a lot of that. And my whole job there was doing the whole clinical planning for all the studies in a ton of different therapeutic areas. And every time to try and utilize patient recruitment, again, the pushback a lot of times would be the cost associated with it. The J&Js, the Mercks, the Pfizers, they have those pockets. But sometimes, especially when you're focusing on rare disease and some of these smaller populations, and you've got some of these smaller biotechs, that's where the problems are. And I think finding ways of utilizing portions of it, or finding better ways to communicate to these companies of what they can provide is helpful. But the problem whenever we would try and utilize a company for a small company, and we would tell them they're very cost sensitive, these are their areas of concern, we would always get the packages with all the bells and whistles. And many times they would not hear us of what we actually needed. And it, unfortunately, on studies that desperately needed these, shut the door immediately because it was just way too much money. So one thing I would love for some of these recruitment groups, and I don't know this one, and I don't know how they do things or anything like that, but seeing them being able to do a little bit more, not the tick the boxes and this is all we offer, but the piecemeal of this part or this part, or this part, this is what's really needed, or this is really what's going to give you the most bang for the buck. And if things were a little bit more streamlined, especially, knowing your audience, right? Knowing who the client is, I think would lend what would be a great tool to be utilized a lot more frequently, if that makes sense.
Well, so you're saying that it needs to be tailored and customized. So again,
right.
Here's the options. If you want bells and whistles, you can add those, but here's the options.
Right. And I personally did not get that from whenever we would use patient recruitment, even though we would go and say, we just need these aspects. It would be a whole lot more. And the door got shut before the negotiations could really happen.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, you've been very gracious with your time. I guess it would be worth asking, as long as we're talking about diversity and inclusion, that, gender, for example, too, I've read women are underrepresented in cardiovascular trials, for example, even though the incidence is higher than we would guess. Are there any fundamental or structural issues there that need to be addressed?
Well, I think a lot of times too, it's part of how we test, right? When you have people of childbearing potential, those risks are also always greatly increased. And when you're dealing with a lot of things, needing to make sure for the safety of everyone I think that makes it harder to recruit, right? And it's a bit easier for the men that are involved than the women that are involved, and what the limitations are. But yeah, I think, and I don't know, but my guess would be, a lot of times in cardiovascular, I think people forget how many, that it is a big issue in women. And I don't know how much of it is because you have to be on, all this birth control. And if you have women in a childbearing potential, and we got a small window as it is,
Yes.
And so I don't know if that lends to part of the problems and concerns. And then you can see now with everything going on with the vaccine, I cannot tell you how many friends I've had calling me because they have daughters who are afraid that they're not going to be able to have children, right? So I think there's still a fear, when you don't know how it's going to affect you. And I do think that will limit the involvement, depending on the severity of the disease, or, oncology, it's a bit different. You're trying to save your life and get through. And I think in some of these other ones that I think there's a fear factor, justifiably so, as you don't know, depending on what the mechanism is.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, Gretchen, this has been terrific. Thanks for your insights.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You take care of yourself. You still running?
Not as much, but Jenny gets out in those foothills that you keep seeing those pictures of.
Yeah.
And she's out there, and we have a great dog. He's about 6 years old. And so they go running out in the foothills quite a bit.
I think I'm still recovering.
Trail running's all about it. Oh my gosh.
Yeah. I think I still am recovering from the last one I did. So
yeah, a good walk is good for me right now.
I'm all about the walking. It's great.
That's right. All right. Well, we'll touch base again soon, I hope.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Right. My love to Jenny too.
We'll do it. Okay. Bye now.
Bye.